Something is happening right now to empaths all over the world that nobody is talking about. They've been quiet, some of them for months, some for years. They pulled back from friendships, walked away from relationships, left jobs, stopped answering calls, and everyone around them interpreted this as defeat, as breakdown, as the empath finally crumbling under the weight of a world they were too sensitive to handle. But Carl Jung documented something about this exact pattern that would make every person who dismissed them deeply uncomfortable. What looks like retreat is actually preparation. What looks like collapse is actually reorganization at the deepest psychological level. Jung studied individuals who went through extended periods of withdrawal and silence after years of giving themselves away, and what he found on the other side of that silence wasn't a broken person. It was someone so fundamentally restructured that the people who knew them before couldn't recognize what they'd become. He called it the return of the individuated self, and he said it was the most powerful psychological transformation a human being could undergo. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about the empath's comeback, the specific psychological shifts that occur during the silent period that make this transformation irreversible, and why the version of you that's about to emerge will be unrecognizable to everyone who thought your sensitivity was weakness. Because this isn't a recovery story, this is an origin story, and it's already underway. To understand what's actually happening during the empath's comeback, you have to understand what Jung saw when he studied empaths at their lowest point. He didn't see fragile people who'd been broken by the world. He saw people who'd been running an impossible operation for decades. They'd been metabolizing other people's emotional waste since childhood, processing grief that wasn't theirs, carrying anxiety that belonged to their parents, their partners, their friends, their co-workers. Their entire nervous system had been functioning as an emotional processing plant for everyone around them, and nobody, not a single person, had ever asked whether the plant could handle the load. Jung recognized that empaths don't just feel other people's emotions. They unconsciously take responsibility for regulating those emotions. The empath in a family system becomes the one who manages everyone's mood. The empath in a relationship becomes the one who monitors their partner's emotional temperature and adjusts their own behavior to keep the peace. The empath in a workplace becomes the one absorbing team tension, so conflict doesn't erupt. They do this automatically, without conscious choice, because their nervous system was wired in childhood to treat other people's emotional states as emergencies that require immediate response. This isn't generosity. Jung was very clear about that. This is a survival pattern that got locked in place before the empath had any say in the matter. The child who learned to regulate their parents' emotions did so because an unregulated parent was dangerous. A mother spiraling into depression meant no one was watching the child. A father escalating into rage meant physical threat. So the child's nervous system learned to detect emotional shifts in others and intervene before those shifts became dangerous. That pattern saved the child's life. And then it spent the next 20 or 30 years slowly destroying the adult. Because what works in a dangerous childhood home becomes catastrophic in adult life. The empath walks through the world treating every human being's emotional state as their responsibility. They can't sit with someone's sadness without trying to fix it. They can't witness anger without trying to soothe it. They can't be in the presence of dysfunction without attempting to heal it. And every single one of these interventions costs them something: energy, time, identity. pieces of themselves they hand over so automatically they don't even notice they're doing it. Jung documented that empaths in this pattern eventually hit a wall, not a gentle realization. A wall. Their system simply cannot process anymore. The emotional processing plant shuts down because the load has exceeded capacity for so long that the machinery breaks. This is the point where empaths withdraw, where they go quiet, where everyone thinks they've fallen apart. But Jung saw something different happening inside that shutdown, something remarkable. The empath psyche, freed from the constant demand of processing everyone else's emotional material, begins for the first time to process its own. And what it finds is extraordinary. Buried beneath decades of other people's emotions are the empath's own feelings, desires, boundaries, identity, and power. All of it suppressed, all of it waiting, all of it intact. This is the beginning of the comeback, not the moment the empath returns to the world, the moment the empath finally meets themselves. Jung called this phase the descent, and he was adamant that it couldn't be rushed or bypassed. The empath has to go down before they come back. They have to sit in the silence, in the emptiness, in the disorientation of not knowing who they are without everyone else's emotions filling them up. This terrifies most empaths because they've never experienced themselves without the noise. They've always been full of other people's feelings. The silence feels like death. But it isn't death, it's space. And in that space, something begins to grow that the empath has never experienced before. Their own authentic emotional life, their own desires, their own anger, their own boundaries, their own sense of what they want rather than what everyone else needs. Jung described watching patients in this phase with something close to awe. He said it was like watching someone discover they had limbs they'd never used. The empath begins to feel their own feelings for the first time, and those feelings are powerful precisely because they've been compressed and denied for so long. The anger comes first. Jung observed this consistently. The empath who has spent their entire life accommodating, soothing, absorbing, and forgiving suddenly contacts a rage that terrifies them. Because they're not just angry about one thing, they're angry about everything. Every boundary that was crossed, every time they said yes when they meant no, every relationship where they gave everything and received nothing. Every moment they abandoned themselves to manage someone else's comfort. The accumulated anger of a lifetime of self-betrayal rises to the surface, and it is volcanic. Most empaths try to suppress this anger because it contradicts their identity. Empaths are supposed to be gentle, understanding, forgiving. Rage doesn't fit the persona, but Jung was insistent that this anger was sacred. He called it the shadow, reclaiming its territory. The parts of the empath that had been denied, the fierce parts, the selfish parts, the parts that could say no without guilt and walk away without looking back, were finally asserting themselves. And they had decades of fuel behind them. This is the phase where empaths start cutting people off, not from cruelty, from clarity. The anger burns away the fog of obligation and reveals who was actually there for them and who was just using the emotional processing plant. The results are devastating because most of the people in the empath's life were there for the service the empath provided, not for the person providing it. When the empath stops providing that service, those people reveal themselves immediately. They get angry, they guilt trip, they accuse the empath of changing, of being selfish, of abandoning them. and every one of those reactions confirms what the empath's anger already knew. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. After the anger comes something Jung found even more transformative: grief. Not grief for what was lost, but grief for what was never there. The empath grieves the parent who was supposed to protect them, but instead required protection. The partner who was supposed to be an equal, but instead was a dependent. The friendships that were supposed to be reciprocal, but instead were one-directional streams of emotional labor, flowing from the empath outward with nothing coming back. This grief is different from depression, though it looks similar from the outside. Depression is a collapse of energy and meaning. This grief is a clearing. The empath is mourning illusions, mourning the fantasy that if they just gave enough, loved enough, healed enough, they'd finally receive what they needed. Jung called this the death of the savior complex, and he said it was the single most important psychological death an empath could experience. Because as long as the empath believes they can earn love through service, they'll keep giving themselves away. The grief kills that belief, and when that belief dies, the empath is finally free. What emerges from this process is what Jung called the individuated empath. And this person bears so little resemblance to who they were before that it genuinely unsettles the people around them. The individuated empath still feels deeply. Their sensitivity hasn't been destroyed, but it's no longer running the show. It's no longer dictating their choices, their relationships, their entire orientation to the world. Instead, it's become one tool among many, a perceptual gift they can engage or disengage as they choose. Jung documented specific characteristics of empaths who completed this transformation, and every one of them represents a complete inversion of the wounded empath pattern. Where the wounded empath couldn't say no, the individuated empath says no with ease and without guilt, not because they've become cold, because they've learned that no is the guardian of yes. Every no they speak protects the energy, time, and presence they need for the things and people that actually matter. Where the wounded empath absorbed everyone's emotions automatically, the individuated empath perceives emotions without absorbing them. They can sit with someone in tremendous pain and remain compassionately present without taking that pain into their own body. This looks heartless to people accustomed to the old version. They want the empath to suffer alongside them. But the individuated empath understands that suffering with someone doesn't help them. Being present without drowning helps them, and that requires the empath to maintain their own center. Where the wounded empath chased people who were emotionally unavailable, the individuated empath is drawn to people who can actually show up. This shift happens naturally as the empath's own emotional availability changes. When you're no longer trying to earn love through service, you stop being attracted to people who need to be served. When you're no longer trying to heal someone to prove your value, you stop being magnetized by wounded people who refuse to heal themselves. The individuated empath's relational field changes completely. They attract differently because they are different. Where the wounded empath betrayed their own perception to maintain relationships, the individuated empath trusts what they see immediately and acts on it. Their pattern recognition, their ability to read people, their capacity to sense dynamics beneath the surface, all of these abilities sharpen rather than diminish during the comeback. But the crucial difference is that the individuated empath uses these perceptions for self-protection rather than for rescue missions. They see someone's dysfunction and choose distance rather than seeing dysfunction and choosing to fix it. Jung found one characteristic of the individuated empath particularly striking: comfort with solitude. The wounded empath was terrified of being alone because being alone meant sitting with their own unprocessed material, and that material was too painful to face. So they surrounded themselves with people, projects, causes, anything to avoid the silence. The individuated empath has already faced what was in the silence. They've sat with their own grief, rage, abandonment, and fear. They've survived the descent. So solitude is no longer threatening. It's restorative. They can be alone without being lonely because they've finally become someone worth being alone with. This is the comeback Jung described, and it's important to understand why he considered it the most powerful transformation available. It's not because the empath gains some supernatural ability they didn't have before. It's because they stopped giving away abilities they always possessed. The empath's sensitivity was always power. Their perception was always accurate. Their ability to read people and environments was always extraordinary. They just spent their lives handing that power to everyone around them, using it to serve others at their own expense. The comeback isn't about gaining power. It's about stopping the hemorrhage of power that's been happening since childhood. Jung compared this to a river that had been diverted. The empath's psychic energy had been flowing outward toward everyone else for decades. The comeback redirects that river inward. And when all of that energy, all of that perceptive power, all of that emotional intelligence flows back toward the empath themselves, the force of it is staggering. They become creative in ways they haven't been since childhood. They make decisions with a clarity that shocks people. They set boundaries that seem effortless because the energy backing those boundaries is the full force of a river, finally flowing in its natural direction. But Jung warned about something that happens during the comeback that most empaths don't expect. Resistance. Not internal resistance, external. The people who benefited from the old system will fight ferociously to restore it. Family members who relied on the empath's emotional labor will escalate. Partners who depended on the empath's accommodation will create crises. Friends who counted on the empath's availability will weaponize guilt. Entire social systems that were organized around the empath's self-sacrifice will destabilize. This resistance feels personal, but Jung recognized it as systemic. The empath was a load-bearing wall in every relationship structure they inhabited. When that wall starts moving, every structure it supported begins to shake. The people inside those structures aren't attacking the empath out of malice. They're panicking because the architecture of their emotional lives is collapsing. They need the empath back in position. They need the processing plant running again. This is the critical juncture where many empaths abort the comeback. The guilt becomes overwhelming. The accusations of selfishness hit the wound directly. The fear of abandoning people who need them triggers the original childhood pattern, and they fold, they go back, they restart the plant, and everything returns to the way it was, except now the empath carries an additional layer of grief because they glimpsed freedom and chose captivity. Jung was fierce about this moment. He told his patients that the resistance they encountered was proof the transformation was real. If no one resisted, nothing had actually changed. The The discomfort of the people around you is evidence that you've stopped serving a function that was destroying you. Their anger is confirmation that the dynamic was never mutual. Their guilt-tripping is proof that they valued your service more than your well-being. Let the resistance be information rather than instruction. The empaths who survived this phase, who held their ground despite the pressure, who tolerated the guilt without acting on it, who watched relationships collapse without rushing to rebuild them. These empaths emerged into something Jung could only describe as psychological sovereignty. They belonged to themselves completely, not partially, not conditionally, completely. Their energy was their own. Their time was their own. Their emotional life was their own. For the first time in their existence, they were not an extension of someone else's need. Jung observed that this sovereignty changed everything about how these empaths moved through the world. Their presence shifted. Where they once entered rooms trying to manage everyone's comfort, they now entered rooms centered in themselves. Where they once spoke carefully to avoid triggering anyone, they now spoke truthfully because their self-expression was no longer hostage to someone else's reaction. Where they once dimmed themselves to make others comfortable, they now occupied their full space because they'd finally accepted that their fullness wasn't responsible for other people's insecurity. This is the comeback, not a return to who you were, an arrival at who you were always supposed to be before the world taught you that your purpose was to serve everyone else's emotional needs. The empath's biggest comeback isn't about recovering from damage. It's about finally claiming the life that was always waiting beneath the pattern of self-sacrifice. If you're in the silent phase right now, if you've pulled back, gone quiet, lost people, and can't explain to anyone why you had to, Jung would tell you that you're not falling apart. You're being reassembled. The silence isn't emptiness. It's the space where your authentic self is finally being given room to exist. The relationships that fell away weren't losses. They were the system correcting itself, removing structures that required your self-abandonment as a foundation. The anger you're feeling isn't a problem. It's your shadow reclaiming territory that was stolen. The grief you're carrying isn't weakness. It's the death of illusions that kept you imprisoned. The loneliness you're experiencing isn't failure. It's the necessary emptiness before the right things and people can arrive. Your comeback has already begun. It started the moment you stopped answering the phone for people who only called when they needed something. It started when you sat in silence and didn't immediately fill it with someone else's needs. It started when you felt the volcanic anger and didn't suppress it. It started when you grieved without trying to fix the grief, without trying to heal faster, without apologizing for how long it was taking. Jung spent his career studying transformation, and he concluded that the empath's comeback was among the most dramatic he'd ever witnessed. Because the distance between who the empath was and who they become is so vast that it constitutes a genuine death and rebirth. The person who emerges isn't a healed version of the old self. They're an entirely different psychological entity. One who still carries the gift of deep feeling, but who is no longer controlled by it. One who sees clearly, but no longer sacrifices themselves for what they see. One who can love profoundly without disappearing into that love. That person is who you're becoming right now. In the silence, in the withdrawal, in the uncomfortable, disorienting, seemingly endless dark. You're not broken. You're being forged. And what's coming isn't a return to normal. It's an arrival at something you've never experienced before. Your own life, lived on your own terms, with your full power intact and directed by your own will for the first time. That's the empath's biggest comeback, and it's not about to begin. It's already happening. You just needed someone to tell you that what feels like destruction is actually construction. What feels like ending is actually beginning. And what feels like losing everything is actually the first moment of having yourself. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.